Good evening, I'm Leonardo Puglisi. Welcome to Uncensored, where we go in depth with a key newsmaker about issues that matter to them and matter to you. There's no editing, no shouting, and no debates. We're here to ask our guests the tough questions, no matter their political views. We also want to hear from you, the viewer, so join the conversation by using hashtag 6newsau in the comments or on social media, or you can email your feedback to us as well. contact@6newsau.com. David Limbrick is the Liberal Democrats MP for the South Eastern Metropolitan Region in Victoria, one of Dan Andrews' biggest critics throughout the pandemic. More recently, he strongly opposed the controversial pandemic legislation that has now come into effect, attending multiple protests where he was seen shaking hands with marchers. But with state and federal elections coming up next year, some are asking, what impact could the Lib Dems have? I spoke to him earlier from the newsroom and started off by asking what his party stands for and what he stands for.
The Liberal Democrats have been around since 2001, so we've actually been around for 20 years. And our party was built on the idea of defending the rights and liberties of Australians. So, our philosophy is sometimes called a classical liberal or libertarian philosophy. So our whole focus for the last, 20 years in politics has been around defending against government overreach into people's lives. And that's probably explains a lot of why there's been a lot of interest in our party over the last couple of years, because there's been a massive expansion of government encroachment into our lives during the pandemic. And I think, when people have their liberties taken away, they look around and wondering who's actually defending those liberties. And that's been us for 20 years. So that probably explains a lot of things. Yeah.
Now, on the pandemic bill here in Victoria obviously recently passed. You were a pretty major opponent of it. Why exactly did you oppose it?
Yeah, well, we started when the state of emergency was first declared back in early 2020. We were quite open-minded about the government using emergency powers, because we thought, yes, it's an emergency. Anyone who knows the history of emergency powers knows that they can lead to bad situations. So we said, we're not going to interfere. We're going to just watch it closely, what the government does. And then that first period was 6 months. And when it got to the end of that 6 months, the government wanted to extend it. And we weren't happy with the way that the government was using the powers, because they weren't being transparent about the underlying reasons behind the way that they use the powers. They also weren't transparent about the human rights impacts of what they were doing, so the moral calculations that they were doing. And we also weren't convinced that the actions that they were taking were the least restrictive of rights as required by the law. We had no evidence that they were actually the least restrictive responses. So we didn't feel that we had enough reassurance that the government was using the powers responsibly. So we opposed continuing that. Then we opposed it again this year when it came up for a vote. And then when they brought up the concept of the pandemic legislation, we opposed that as well, because this year we've seen some of the most extreme uses of power that the government's had, not just the lockdowns, but also, we've seen total suppression of the right to freedom of assembly, including, opening fire on civilians. And we decided that we didn't think that it was a good idea to keep giving the government this sort of power. So we opposed it strongly.
Now, you did tweet once the bill passed that the final product was less terrible. What changes to it did you think were an improvement?
Yeah, so one of the things that was originally in the bill was what was called an aggravated offence, which included a 2-year jail term. That wasn't in the final bill. Our concern with that was we couldn't see many situations that someone would be charged with this that wouldn't already be covered by existing crimes. And we were worried that the government was going to start singling out businesses, for example, that might not want to comply with these vaccine passport rules and make an example of them. So we were very happy that they removed that from the final bill. There was also some changes to the oversight mechanisms. We were very unhappy with the originally proposed oversight. They've set up a new parliamentary committee that's going to handle the oversight. But some of the key things that we were concerned about weren't fixed. So the ability for Parliament to disallow things, technically they can be disallowed in the final bill, but it's very, very unlikely because it would only happen if the government supported it, which, basically means the government controls it. So Parliament itself can't really easily do it.
Now, I know you were at some of those recent protests against the bill, and there was that viral clip I saw of you, shaking hands with a bunch of marchers there. What was that like, and what kinds of people are you seeing protesting against these kind of restrictions and legislation?
Yeah, look, I've been going to protests all throughout the pandemic. I started back in June, and I feel that it's the job of a member of Parliament, June 2020, and that actually had nothing to do with the lockdowns or anything. That was actually the Black Lives Matter protest, and I feel that it's a job of a member of Parliament to listen to the concerns of people. And also, I was concerned about the police response to protests during a pandemic. And when I went to the Black Lives Matter march, actually, I thought the police managed it very well. But what I've seen more recently is very, very large numbers of people, very, very diverse group of people, all sorts. So, from all across the political spectrum, many immigrants. You'll see in pictures of the protests, lots of people carrying flags. And I went up and spoke to lots of these people, and like people who carry flags of their country that they immigrated from. And a common theme that many of them spoke to me about is many people and their families or their ancestors or they themselves immigrated to Australia because we're a free country, right? And a lot of these people came from countries where they had, very authoritarian regimes. Think places like, Soviet Russia and Vietnam and Poland and lots of these sort of places. And they were concerned about this authoritarian response by the government here. And a common thing that many people said to me was, I've already fled one country. I don't want to flee another. I want to stand up to fight for the rights of Victorians and against what the government's been doing. So, that was a really common theme. Another common theme was people who oppose the idea of the government pushing medical procedures onto people without their proper consent. And that's something that I'm very concerned about as well. We didn't have any problem. My party didn't have any problem with the vaccine rollout until they started making it mandatory. And then we were saying, well, because it's mandatory and you're saying to people, you're going to lose your job, we feel that undermines consent of people, which is a very critical thing in a doctor-patient relationship.
Look, I'll get back to mandatory vaccines in a moment, but you mentioned the Black Lives Matter protests in June 2020 there. Do you think the police response could have been different? Because, the recent ones we've seen, the more publicised, not the ones against the bill, one was under lockdown restrictions when we were in lockdown. The BLM one was not. And also, I don't recall any, pretty major violence at the BLM rallies in Melbourne. So do you think there was justified reasons for a different response?
No, I don't think so. So at the BLM rally, at the time there was restrictions of groups of 20, up to groups of 20 people, and I think there was probably about 10 to 15,000 people there. So it was clearly in breach of Cho directions. This is something that I questioned a lot about at the Parliamentary Accounts and Estimates Committee, and I questioned the Chief Commissioner himself, like, why did these protests have such wildly different responses? Like, there was a protest that I went to at Cup Day in 2020, only a few months after BLM, and the police response was very severe. And the only difference in the restrictions at that time was, there was groups of 10 or more were banned. And at the BLM rally, it was 20. So, at both of them, that well exceeded that. But at that one, they arrested nearly everyone that they could. So I think they arrested over 400 people there, and including me. I was just going along. I wasn't speaking at it or anything. I was just going along to witness it, and I got caught up in it. They pushed everyone together in what they call a kettling maneuver, and then process them one by one. So, the response from the chief commissioner was that they were worried about violence at the Black Lives Matter protest because they'd seen what happened in the United States. There was widespread, looting and stuff like that, and they didn't want to have a severe response. That was the response from the chief commissioner at questioning. But look, there was at the more recent, I think at the Black Lives Matter protest, from memory, there was about 6 arrests, but it was generally peaceful protest. And the more recent protests that we've seen, there's been no arrests, I think, like over the last few weeks. But during the lockdown, earlier this year, there was a lot of scenes, when we saw lots of scenes of chaos. And I think a lot of that is due to the fact that at the time they were arresting people who even tried to organize protests. They were arresting them for incitement. And so, of course, if you get a lot of people that are unorganized and go onto the streets, you end up with an unorganized protest. And that's exactly what we saw, people going in random directions and totally uncontrolled, no clear messaging. It was just like people who were frustrated and hitting the streets. And, that leads to problems. And I'd been saying for a long time to the police and the government that rather than try and suppress the right to freedom of assembly as a way of minimizing harm, they should facilitate it to the best way that they can. And more recently, they have been doing that. And we've seen, very few arrests and no, fights or anything like that. It's been much better.
Yeah, and I can back up talking about people going in different directions, because there was one that was in the suburb of Hawthorne. It was also in Kew and Richmond, which is right where I live and right where the 6 News HQ is. So there were certainly a lot of people going in different directions, and it did lead to some violence. So I can see what you're saying there. Now, given those reports that have been circulating online about far-right extremists and even neo-Nazis attending in small numbers at some of these protests, did you see anything like that? Did you see any, anti-Semitic signs, as some people have been pointing out, or do you think, majority of the people were, not extremists?
I didn't personally see any. I've seen pictures of some that were circulated online, but I think, that's certainly not representative of the, you saw the pictures of me. I met thousands of people at these things and spoke to as many people as I could. I certainly wouldn't think that that's, representative. I don't know about, neo-Nazis, maybe there's some far right people, I don't know. But, like I said, there's a very diverse group of people that go to these. And what the government's been doing all along throughout the pandemic is any sort of opposition to what they've been doing, they've been demonizing that opposition. So early on, they were saying, anyone that opposes us, they're crazy, or they're, immoral, or they're extremists, or they're conspiracy theorists. They've been saying this the entire way through. And just the more recent way of demonizing opposition is, anyone protesting is a far right extremist. Well, if we've got, up to 100,000 people or whatever the numbers were out on the street, if they're all far-right extremists, then we've got bigger problems, I think. But I don't think that's the case, fortunately. I think a lot of these people are just people who are fed up or concerned about what the government's been doing, and they wanted to express that on the streets. So, yeah.
Now, you mentioned mandatory vaccines there. You're saying that, you don't have any problems with the general vaccine rollout until it becomes mandatory in some settings. Do you think there are any settings where it, should or is, right to be mandatory? Healthcare, aged care, hospitals, is any of that, should any of that require a mandatory vaccine, or just think blanket there shouldn't be any?
Oh, look, I think you raise a really good point. For me, it comes down to consent, right? Whether the person consents to it or not. Now, when you've got someone who works in healthcare, usually as part of their job in their employment contract, it will have conditions of their employment. And if one of the conditions of their employment is to have, vaccines, then they've consented to that. So I don't actually have a problem with that if it's part of their employment contract. But what I do have a problem with is where someone works in, say, a supermarket, and that was never part of the deal when they signed up. And then the government forces the employer, so this is not necessarily the employer's choice, the government forces the employer to tell that person, you have to take a medical procedure dictated by the government or you're going to lose your job. Then we have a problem because consent is undermined in that situation. And I think that, certainly in healthcare and aged care, they already had conditions under their employment to take certain vaccines and things like this. So, it's less of a problem in those situations because I don't feel that it undermines consent as much as other jobs like, retail or construction workers who never had anything like that. And it wasn't part of the deal when they signed up. And certainly with the idea of, this vaccine passport thing where they divide up society, some of the consequences of that have been, horrific.
Now, moving on to that recent polling from the Herald Sun that showed strong support reasonably for a number of minor parties. You said on Twitter it was strange that the United Australia Party and One Nation were included in it and the Liberal Democrats were apparently not. You said you'd follow up with the paper. Did you actually manage to get any answers?
Yes, I did. So I did follow. So the reason I thought it was strange is because United Australia Party is not registered at a state level. So they never ran in another state election, and I don't know if they've got intentions to run in the next state election. Similarly with One Nation, they are registered. They're still registered, but they never ran in the last state election either. I don't know why they didn't run, but they never ran. And we've run here in state elections for years. And so I thought it was strange that we weren't in there. I didn't actually get good answers though. So I don't really know the reasons why that was set up like that. But I think what the poll did show is that there's, a large amount of support for non-major parties. And that's been a continuing theme for years now, but it's accelerated recently.
Look, if you had to take a guess, do you reckon you'd be doing around the same as the UAP as that poll suggested, or better if you were included?
I don't know. Like we've certainly had a lot more engagement. Like UAP's fairly recent in Victoria, and they don't really have much, local representation. Whereas we've got, 2 elected members of parliament. We've been engaged in this whole pandemic situation in Victoria right from the start. So, if I was going to take a guess, I'd think that we'd have higher polling, but, I don't know. I'm only guessing, I suppose.
Yeah. Now, there was that other polling suggesting Dan Andrews is on track for a third term as Victorian Premier, despite these lockdowns, protests and everything that's gone on this year and last year. Do you agree with that polling, and do you reckon we could see a Labor government re-elected in November 2022?
Anything's possible. Look, there's a lot of people who are upset with the way the government's been handling things, but there's also a lot of people who, think that they've done a good job. Partly it's also up to the opposition party as well, the coalition. Whether people feel that they can provide some sort of, desirable alternative to the Labor Party. And also what happens with the minor parties, if there is a big drift to minor parties, what sort of influence will that have on the final outcome? I think a lot of this, we're in uncharted waters here because everything's been shaken up and, traditional political lines that people were on don't necessarily hold anymore. Like a lot of the people at these protests probably would have, some of them would have been traditional Labor voters, and now they're upset with the government. So, what does that mean for the future of the Labor Party in Victoria? I don't know. Anything's possible over the next year.
Now, in November, you announced your intention to put your hand up for the federal Senate at the next election next year. Why did you decide to, attempt to make the move from state to federal, given I'm sure there are a lot of people who would want you to stay in Victoria, given, everything that's been happening?
Well, if I was successful in being elected to the Senate, I'd still be representing Victoria, but I'd be doing it at a federal level. Look, I think one of the things that became very apparent during the pandemic was the lack of a number of voices defending, liberty at the federal level, and I've been quite disappointed with the federal government, and they haven't really spoken out about a lot of the things that have happened in Victoria. They've just let it go, and I was convinced by lots of people that we should try and get more voices to defend liberty in the federal parliament, and now's the time to do it. So I've announced my intention to do that, and lots of people have shown their support of that, and so we'll see how we go with it.
All right, just finally, with 2022 just around the corner, are you worried for Victoria with this new bill? Are you optimistic for the future? Are you thinking that the Liberal Democrats could see a surge both state and federally? What are you feeling?
Oh, look, I mean, with regards to our party, we've had a huge growth in membership and support over the last year. So, I'm optimistic that we'll get more people elected eventually at a state and federal level. With regards to the pandemic, look, I'm fearful. I don't like the government having as much power as it's got. I'm hopeful that they will remove some of these restrictions, like the mandates and the passport thing, because it's just had such a terrible effect on lots of people. And I'm, lots of people, I'm looking at the Northern Hemisphere and the winter that they've got there now, and the governments are coming in with new restrictions. And yes, I'm concerned that we're going to end up doing the same thing when we hit our winter. So, I've still got a lot of concerns about, what's going to happen over the next year, as do lots of other Victorians. But ultimately, I'm optimistic. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in politics.
All right, Liberal Democrats MP David Limbrick, thanks for your time and for joining us here on 6 News.
Thanks for having me, Leah.
There we go. That was Liberal Democrats MP David Limbrick speaking to me earlier. As always, we'd love to hear what you have to say about what he had to say. So join the conversation by using hashtag 6newsau in the comments or on social media, or you can email your feedback to us as well. contact@6newsau.com. Make sure you share the link to this video on social media too, and don't forget to let us know who you want us to speak to next. I'm Leonardo Puglisi. Have a great night.